I want to thank Darius for that wonderful introduction. You know, it's almost a kind of surreal experience when you hear people talk about you. You just think you're doing your work. It also makes me sound really old. I also want to thank the American Association of Blacks in Higher Ed. I want to thank its officers and executives. A special thanks to Angela Caraway for all the logistics. She has just been marvelous in making sure that everything came together. I also want to thank the Delaney family for whom this award is named. I've had a chance to speak with Milton Delaney several times in the weeks leading up to this day, and he sends his regrets, of course, that they can't be here. They have in the past. It's really interesting because I have some wonderful connections with the Delaneys. We're both from Philadelphia. Dr. Delaney taught at Morgan State University, and that's my undergraduate alma mater. He was a chemistry professor, and I started out thinking I was going to be a chemistry major. There gets to be a place when you hit organic chemistry that you decide whether you're going to do this or not. And me and O. Kim decided, no, you're not doing this. But I want to just share with you some remarks that I've titled, Still Black at the Academy.edu. I think there's an unfortunate set of beliefs that are held by both Black and African Americans that personal qualities like intelligence or academic accomplishment and coolness or cultural competence are mutually exclusive. It is difficult enough to fight against such perceptions among whites and others outside of a cultural group, but the idea that African Americans themselves accept this mythology creates a difficult climate for those of us who have dedicated our lives to improving the education life chances of Black people. So first, let me be clear. I do not subscribe to the blame the victim mentality that says that Black students are struggling in school and in life because they think that being smart is equivalent to acting white. The empirical evidence suggests that Black students are no more likely than their Latino, Asian, and yes, white peers to call high academic performance, quote, acting white. Rather, we find an increasing number of Black students who are attempting to forge academic identities that allow them the full measure of their humanity, culture, and all. So for the purpose of these remarks, I'm going to speak from a deeply personal narrative about what it means to maintain a relevant Black identity as a scholar in the academy. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to spend a year as a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And anyone who has spent 20 years in Wisconsin appreciates the luxury of a winter without snowplows. My familiarity with the San Francisco Bay Area made my adjustment to life at the center an easy one. On one of my frequent visits to the main campus, I ran into a colleague from the provost's office who was proudly strutting across the campus wearing a black t-shirt that read in stark white letters, "Still Black at Stanford.edu." The first thing I wanted to know is where she got that shirt. It turned out that it was a promotional shirt for all of the Black student organizations on the campus. So on the back, all of the Black sororities, fraternities, academic, social, and civic organizations were listed. It was a clever idea, but I became more intrigued with the symbolism of the notion of, quote, still being Black at Stanford. As a Stanford alumna, I had a pretty good idea of how difficult it was to maintain any sense of humanity on that campus, let alone a Black humanity. And I know this because I carefully looked at the institution's history and record of dealing with African Americans. I happen to have a habit of investigating histories wherever I go, and you can blame that on my training. When I left chemistry, I went to history. Stanford University was founded by former California Governor and U.S. Senator Leland Stanford. In addition to his public service, Stanford made a fortune as a railroad man, You may have heard of the debate about changing the mascot for Stanford many years ago. They used to be the Stanford Indians. And when they asked the students to come up with names, the students came up with really clever names, of course, names that the university wouldn't use. And the most popular name among the students was, let's call ourselves the robber barons. And I'm like, yeah, that would fit. That's, you know. Stanford was one of the infamous Big Four who built the Transcontinental Railroad. And scholars have documented the ruthlessness of these industrialists who lacked expertise and ethics when it came to robbing the nation's coffers and lining their own already substantial pockets. The one place of vulnerability in Stanford's life was his family, specifically his young son. Stanford and his wife, Jane Lathrop Stanford, became parents late in life, and they realized that Leland Jr. would be their only offspring. They spared no expense on the child that they raised on their extensive farm located in the San Francisco Bay Peninsula. Just before his 16th birthday, on a family trip to Italy, young Leland contracted typhoid fever and died. Senator and Mrs. Leland Stanford became so despondent that they could not return to the U.S. After several months of grieving, some of Stanford's friends joined them in Europe and persuaded them to consider building and dedicating a university library in their son's name. On their way back to the Bay Area, the Stanfords stopped at every major European university and several East Coast schools and collected ideas for the kind of memorial that they wanted to leave to honor their son. When the couple arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they met with the president of Harvard University. And legend has it that Senator Stanford asked how much it would cost to build Harvard. They had to build Harvard all over again. How much would it cost? Not just a library. President Eliot of Harvard indicated that a comparable university would take an endowment of $5 million. Now remember, this is the late 1800s. The Stanfords looked at each other and said, we could do that. And on October 1st, 1891, Stanford University opened for business. One of the 21 original departments of the new campus was the education department. Some 7 years later, in 1898, Elwood P. Coverly, who was a former superintendent of the San Diego School District, was named department chair and later dean of the program. This is the same Elwood P. Coverly who declared the need for separate schools for the, quote, overage, defective, delinquent, or the Negro race. Coverly had a genetic or at least ethnic hierarchy in his mind when it came to deciding who was worthy of attending Stanford School of Education and who was worthy of a public education. He saw the school as rightly serving Anglo-Saxons and other Northern and Western Europeans, but he explicitly challenged the cognitive ability of Eastern and Southern Europeans and other recent immigrants of the time. Needless to say that students of African, Latino, Asian, and American Indian descent were not even considered. So that's the backdrop of Stanford. I want you to fast forward to 1978 and enter a directionless and perhaps overly militant African-American girl from West Philadelphia who dared to enroll in the Stanford University School of Education doctoral program in curriculum and teacher education. Now, at the time, I was probably more interested in a break from frigid East Coast winters than becoming a serious scholar. But make no mistake, I have always been interested in scholarship. It was just that the world of high-powered, research-one academe was an alien place to me. I did not know how to decode it or comprehend it. I knew how to go to classes, read the texts, and write what I thought they were write what I thought about them. I did not know how to read the social worlds that I was entering. I did not know how to do these things, and yet it was clear that my white classmates did. They quickly learned the language and the mores of the academy, and they were quickly welcomed into the academic culture. They were offered research assistantships that put them side by side with some of the nation's best researchers. They were invited to their homes, they traveled with them to conferences, and they were asked to join writing projects. One of my early experiences at graduate school happened when I arrived on campus one day and the school seemed especially empty. I wandered into the office and I asked one of the secretaries, and I do have this tendency to get to know the secretaries and the janitors no matter where I go. And I asked her, well, where everybody was. Oh, she replied, they've gone to AERA. What's AERA? Oh, that's the American Educational Research Association, you know, the professional association. The thing was, I did not know. Well, where's the meeting, I asked. San Francisco, she responded. So there I was, a mere 37 miles south of San Francisco, yet I was a million miles away from the culture of the community of scholars in my very own discipline. It was okay for me to attend classes and pay tuition, perhaps even earn a degree, but I was not a member of this culture. Thus, this black child left behind had that experience that made an indelible impression on her. It was one of the reasons that eventually becoming the president of AERA in 2005 was so deeply satisfying. It's a perfect example of that the best revenge is living well. It's also the reason why I work hard to encourage students, particularly students of color, to participate in the professional associations. I tell my students, I don't care if y'all have to be 7 or 8 to a room. You know, you need to be there. Now, my initial struggles in graduate school were not about how to be black, but rather just how to be. How does one operate in a community where nothing is as it seems? People are polite, but superficial. People profess things that they do not actually believe. And one of the major tasks was to turn real-life problems into finite, analyzable, measurable bits that could be put under a social science lens and shared with other people who do exactly the same thing. Don't get me wrong. There were people doing important work at the School of Education at Stanford. I just could not figure out where the passion for the work resided and who was supposed to benefit from this work. I could see who was being used in the research enterprises, but the beneficiaries almost always seemed to be the researchers. Big grant getters got bigger grants. Highly published scholars published more. Well-known scholars became even more famous, and the problem of poor children in urban schools persisted. There are 2 incidents that come to mind when I think about what it means to be black in the academy. And the first comes from an interview with a colleague from my book, Beyond the Big House, African American Educators on Teacher Education. She indicated that when she talked with her soon-to-be advisor at her top-tier research graduate school, she asked him, how black can I be here at this university? And the puzzled advisor responded, well, how black do you want to be? That question lingers in the air for many of us. How black do we want to be? The second incident occurred when I finally figured out how to get myself to an AERA meeting. Again, the meeting was held in San Francisco. I drove up one evening with a friend and colleague. Actually, you will be honoring her later today, Joyce King. And at one of the sessions, there was a lively debate about Fordham and Ogbu's 1986 acting white hypothesis. And one eminent black scholar remarked indignantly, well, we're here at AERA, we're presenting scholarly papers, we're using standard English, are we acting white? No one responded to his rhetorical question, but I can tell you that the thought that ran through my mind immediately was, well, yes, we are. For clearly, if this forum was something black people organized, it would look a lot different. The paradox of remaining black in the academy is that many of us are recruited because we are black, but admonished for exhibiting any markers of that blackness. What we wear, how we style our hair, how we speak and interact, all are under scrutiny. But it's not merely about what we might call a black aesthetic, it's also about the nature of our scholarship, our teaching, and our service. It is about the terms upon which the Academy wants us to operate. It's about the tentative nature of our scholarship, both on the campuses and in the community of scholars writ large. And so there are three themes that I think characterize the experiences of black faculty on predominantly white campuses. I refer to these themes as: one, you're the diversity expert, except when it matters. Two, you're not like the others, you just speak for them. And three, your work is too narrow. Well, actually, it's just too black. So I want to speak briefly about those themes. Diversity expert, except when it matters. Most faculty of color have had the experience of being seen as the expert in their department, school, college, or campus regarding issues of diversity. When issues regarding diversity arise, faculty of color are regularly called upon. And when a student of color has a problem, they are referred to a faculty member of color. When there are concerns about the content of the curriculum, that is, that it needs to include content about diversity, faculty of color are expected to respond. However, at the same moment, faculty of color are called upon to address these climate issues. Their work on these issues do not count in the currency of the academy. The workshops, the problem solving, the committee service, the additional advising do not count when tenure and promotion committees meet to discuss candidates of color. Despite the amount of time that faculty invest in addressing diversity issues, that investment is not rewarded in the same way that other colleagues' committee and programmatic service is. The typical black faculty member who works hard on diversity issues does this work in addition to all of the other responsibilities that come from being a faculty member. Award-winning scholar Robin D.G. Kelly states in the PBS film Shattering the Silences that as a black faculty member, he is not only the faculty person black and Latino students seek out, but many white students also seek him out. His colleagues have perhaps a half dozen students while he has scores of them. His is a common lament. Like some of my colleagues, I would love to have a small seminar of 8 to 10 students where we could dig deeply into texts and have long discussions. Ultimately, I have classes that are always over 20 students and lack the intimacy of a graduate seminar. The second theme is that you're not like the others, you just speak for them. And it speaks specifically to the exotic perceptions of otherness that come from being a person of color. In filmmaker Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, there's a scene where the character Pino, who was overtly racist, speaks disparagingly about black people. Lee's character Mookie calls him out on it and reminds him that his favorite entertainers and athletes are African Americans. Pino loves people like Michael Jordan and Michael Jackson, but he responds by saying, they're different. They're not really black. What does it mean to be really black? It is clear to me that many white colleagues, even those who proudly claim liberal credentials, are uncomfortable with certain people of color. Now, perhaps the fault line I'm referencing is class, but I'm uncertain that these colleagues are good judges of the class identifications of people of color. Sometimes that fault line is gender. The white female colleague who insists on forging a relationship with another female faculty member of color is visibly nervous in the presence of a black male. And a third fault line is sometimes age. For some reason, young black people strike fear in the hearts of white people. We're on a faculty trip around the state to visit various institutions and facilities with which the university has contacts. And my colleagues and I walked into a Milwaukee high school. We were greeted by a gregarious 14-year-old black boy who extended his right hand and smiled and said in a loud voice, "Hi, my name is Kevin." And after repeating this statement 3 times, literally he was going from person to person. "Hi, my name is Kevin. Hi, my name is Kevin." One of my white male colleagues from the College of Agriculture slipped behind me and whispered, "Who is that?" I responded, "I guess it's Kevin." The shock of his palpable fear was juxtaposed to an earlier stop of the group at a maximum security prison where there was no such fear exhibited. When the African American criminals were locked behind the bars, my colleagues seemed less anxious. But once we walked into a school where young black men were freely walking the corridors, they were visibly upset. Far too many of our white colleagues treat us as if we have some special insight into black life and culture and regularly call on us in voyeur-like fashion to give them a peek into this exotic world. We become the tour guides to otherness, but our colleagues are clear to separate us out from the chaos and disorder that they read as that otherness. We're different, special. We're role models. I think the 1950s term is that we are a credit to our race. The deconstruction of those notions of role models and credits to our race revealed the perspective of a black and other faculty of color as worthy of white affirmation. We have arrived. We know how to behave in ways that are acceptable to the academy. The third theme, your work is too narrow, but really it's just too black, represents an ongoing challenge of black academic life. And although many black faculty members are recruited to bring, quote, diversity to their departments, schools, colleges, and universities, they are presumed to come to their academic positions within extant research and scholarship paradigms. Everyone wants to hire the black faculty who replicates the community's orthodoxy. Black and other scholars who choose to do work that looks at their own racial and cultural groups are perceived as to be doing, quote, self-interested work, as if our white colleagues' work is not self-interested. Far too many times, young scholars of color have contacted me agonizing over the fact that senior colleagues have advised them not to do research tied to their racial or cultural group. They are told that such research will not get published in top-tier journals or will be read as political or polemic. Thus, the very reason for which scholars of color are purportedly invited into the academy is turned on its head. The paradigmatic shifts that scholars of color attempt to make often are thwarted by a reward system that insists they remain within the traditional boundaries. One of the participants in my book explained that when she was preparing for her tenure review, she spent a lot of time and energy educating the Promotion and Tenure Review Committee about the nature of her work and the publication outlet she had chosen for her work. Quote, "I don't know what other people do when they put their tenure files together, but I had to get the committee to see that my work was bigger than tenure and promotion. I was going to do this work whether I was a professor or not, because it's bigger than an academic exercise. It's about the survival of a people." This more politicized nature of the work of African American scholars also places them in jeopardy of not receiving tenure. The demand for so-called objective, neutral scholarship makes almost no sense to African American teacher educators who are keenly aware of the pitiful educational conditions many African American students endure. Now, I want to also point out that not all the news is bad. It might seem that I've framed my remarks solely as negative ones, but it's not the case, because there is a silver lining that cannot be overlooked. First, we have to be clear. There are a ton of jobs that are worse than working in the academy. Indeed, most Black scholars are working at jobs that are better than those of 90% of other Black people. So despite our complaints about our work, it occurs in comfortable surroundings with a decent reward structure. It is not about hard or demeaning labor. We don't dig ditches or clean toilets. We have the jobs our families and loved ones are proud to tell their friends and neighbors about. In my own family, my late father proudly told his supervisors at the college where he served as custodian that he needed to take some time off to attend my brother's graduation from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Finance. Several years later, he told the same supervisor that I was a graduate student at Stanford. Clearly not believing that a poor Black man from West Philadelphia could have children in these illustrious institutions, the supervisor decided to challenge my father. Well, what is your daughter studying at Stanford? My father did not know or care that much about what I was pursuing, but he was cognizant of Stanford's reputation for cutting-edge research. Indeed, about the time that I attended Stanford, the university's primate department was doing linguistic research with a celebrated gorilla named Coco. Clearly chagrined by the supervisor's question, my father remarked, "What difference does it make what she's studying? That's a place that could make an ape talk." But more than the pride of individual accomplishments, Black scholars have a tremendous opportunity to transform the academy into more humane institutions that push our thinking and help us live up to the nation's loftiest ideals. In the 1960s, Black and Latino, Asian American, Native American, and women scholars pushed for a rethinking of the academy. Some of the scholars read the history quite selectively. But it was not just a matter of adding courses that mimic the old paradigm. It was about creating new paradigms that transgress boundaries. These new studies, when we talk about Black studies, it's not just Black history, it's Black studies that cut across disciplines. They combine humanities and social sciences. It asked the scholars to consider what it means to know the experiences of a people through their art, their literature, their histories, their cultures, and other expressions of peoplehood. These studies also included a sense of critique that allows us to look at existing canons. The deciphering work of such studies gives us new ways to make sense of texts and of histories. It opens new ways of thinking and conceptualizing. It raises our scholarship as well as that of our colleagues to new heights because we are challenged to move beyond the places that we became comfortable in a generation ago. We recognize the need to search for new concepts, for new theories and new methodologies, and we take heart in the belief that we can do this work and see ourselves as still Black at the academy.edu. Thank you.